Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. Muffin Talk is a weekly radio program to which I invite guests to talk about their work and their passion for issues on community programs, social justice, Bible studies, or the Catholic Church. Today I have two guests with me, Bill Kilgallon and Dr. Christopher Longhurst. Bill and Chris, a warm welcome to both of you and hi to my radio program.
Thank you, Beate. It's a pleasure to be here. Kia ora, Bill.
Kia ora.
Bill Kilgallon immigrated to New Zealand in 2010 from the UK, where he spent many years in leadership roles in social care, housing, and health. He was chair of the National Catholic Safeguarding Commission for England and Wales from 2007 to 2010. He was the second director of the National Office for Professional Standards of the New Zealand Catholic Church from 2013 to 2018. And a member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors from 2014 to 2017. Dr. Christopher Longhurst is a New Zealander from Ahuriri in Hawke's Bay and a lay Catholic theologian who spent many years working abroad in Rome, Italy, and in Northern Africa. Since 2019, he is the leader of SNAP in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the survivors network of those abused by priests. In a previous Muffin Talk, we learned about the history of SNAP and how it was established more than 35 years ago in the United States. Today, the network is established in countries across the world, including Aotearoa, New Zealand. Bill, your first appointment to a Catholic Safeguarding Commission was 15 years ago for England and Wales. At that time, our Pope was Pope Benedict, and the knowledge about abuse scandals had just spread around the world. 2 years later, you were the head of New Zealand's NOPS, the National Office for Professional Standards. What do you recall when thinking of these times in the UK and in New Zealand?
I think I'd start with an article that was written 2 weeks ago in the Tablet by a former colleague of mine on the Pontifical Commission, and he describes it really well. That's Hans Zollner. He says, no global institution has lost trust and credibility with such spectacular speed and efficiency as the Roman Catholic Church. It has achieved this over 3 decades by simultaneously preaching a message of special care for the poor, the marginalized, and the excluded, while at the same time mercilessly covering up crimes of abuse committed by priests against children, precisely the most weak and vulnerable. And that would describe my experience of working in the church in England and Wales and in New Zealand and internationally.
Chris, and you are the leader of SNAP, a survivors network for those abused by priests. That was established 35 years ago and came to New Zealand about 3.5 years ago in 2019. So can you tell us more about your experience?
Well, I'm a survivor of abuse myself and reached out to the National Office for Professional Standards when I came back to New Zealand in 2016, it was, and reported what happened to me in the care of the Catholic Church in New Zealand. And since then have been, up until today, dealing with trying to have some resolution around redress for my complaints as in the Catholic Church. Complaints that I filed in 2017 are still not resolved today. Yet the Catholic Church in New Zealand promises a fair and compassionate response to survivors. And unfortunately, it hasn't been my experience. And when the New Zealand government began the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care and extended its terms of reference to include faith-based organizations, that's when I reached out to SNAP in the United States of America for support, because here in New Zealand, there weren't any agencies that I knew of that provided that care around the complexity of layers of complexity within faith-based organizations regarding abuse. I felt that my own complaints, my own story was being, in a sense, commodified by the Royal Commission. So long story short, I reached out to the leaders of the Survivors Network in America, and they had a chapter founded in 2019 to support the people who are coming forward to report abuse to the Royal Commission. So one of the challenges I was immediately confronted with was the amount of people that were coming forward to report abuse in faith-based care, then reaching out for SNAP immediately. So we hit the ground running, so to speak, insofar as, again, there wasn't really a support network in New Zealand that dealt with that, with dealing with abuse in faith-based care. So it's quite challenging on that score.
And can you tell us a little bit more about SNAP when it comes to, there are many organizations that look after victims of abuse, trying to support them. In which way is SNAP different to other networks?
Sure, we are a network. We're not really an organization or a institution in the ordinary sense of those terms. We're simply a grassroots movement of survivors supporting survivors. That's our primary kaupapa, our primary mission. So we don't really have a hierarchical structure in that sense. I think what makes us special is that we are survivor-led and survivor-centered. So SNAP is not an organization that supports survivors. It's survivors supporting themselves. And I think that's very important because I don't know of any other organization like that. Granted, again, there are support groups that have leadership. And some people call me the national leader, which I guess I'm a point of reference for survivors. But we're a movement, we're a grassroots movement of victims and survivors who have been abused, who come together to support them ourselves by disclosing what happened to us for the first time, by being believed, and by doing advocacy to help others. SNAP's primary work is to support survivors, though also, if you look at the SNAP mission, we raise awareness around abuse. So we do advocacy work. We seek to protect children and vulnerable people, especially in faith-based institutions. And we advocate to speak out against abuse and to hold abusers to account. SNAP is where its members are. And I use the word members in a very loose way too, because we don't have membership in that regard. We are, again, a grassroots movement throughout New Zealand, throughout the world, by which people come together to support each other and to raise awareness to stop abuse.
Chris, does that mean that they're all volunteers involved in SNAP?
Absolutely. All of our work is voluntary. We are a charitable trust, though we don't have a staff. The persons who do provide peer support are doing it on a voluntary basis. The reason why, based on our logic, is that survivors heal themselves by supporting others as well. My own healing and my own path to recovery has been through providing support for others. In that way, and this is a general humanities principle, we make ourselves stronger, we make ourselves better by helping other people because of the social element of abuse. So that's how we operate, and we advocate that in supporting each other, we heal ourselves. And we do, it works. It's worked for me, it's worked for others. And I'm generalizing, of course, because every person has their own story to tell. But what we do in advocating for victims and survivors of abuse is empower that person to heal through disclosing what happened to them, breaking the shame. There's a lot of shame that's not warranted around abuse for the victim and the survivor. So we believe that there's dignity in surviving abuse, and that there's courage in speaking out. The shame is not warranted. Victims have unwarranted shame. So we seek to break that by encouraging survivors to do what they need to become whole again as a consequence of the abuse.
Thank you, Chris. I think that really helps understand, first of all, where SNAP is coming from, and that's really helpful. And Bill worked for NOPS, so in the Catholic Church leaders in New Zealand. They've made commitments to openness and transparency in dealing with abuse, from as early as 2002 until today. However, I understand that NOPS operates and always has with two committees the Complaints Assessment Committee and the National Safeguarding and Professional Standards Committee. And in your professional view as a former NOPS director, how is the commitment of openness and transparency reconciled with working behind closed doors?
The overall committee, the Professional Standards Committee, it's a registered charity, so the details of who are the members of that board are publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
Its meetings, certainly when I was there, were held in private. And then the Complaints Assessment Committee, the members of that committee did not wish to be named publicly. Now, that's a decision they took. In other professions, in health, in education, on which that assessment committee is modelled, generally the membership is known of those committees. Certainly that was my experience in England and Wales. The individuals were known, they were identified. Obviously, the meetings where you're discussing complaints would be held in private. But I think there's more reluctance in New Zealand to make information public than I found elsewhere. And I think there are a number of things that lead to that. One is the size of the country, that it seems to me everybody knows everybody in New Zealand. There are things in New Zealand that, for example, they don't have in England and Wales. The Privacy Act here is much stronger than it would be in England and Wales. Mm. And also the idea that people who are accused get name suppression. Now, that wouldn't occur in the courts, for example, in England and Wales. But here there's quite a strong issue about suppressing names that I think carries over into other settings. But in all of these things, transparency is vitally important. And I think the church and the churches in New Zealand have fallen down very badly on that. When we heard the evidence at the Royal Commission, it was quite clear that it wasn't an open system of redress in the Catholic Church or in the other churches. And that was really absolutely clear in the evidence that was given there. But I just go back to something that we heard from Christopher, that the real importance of survivors being involved in giving advice, in helping to shape what goes on. It's not easy, because people who've been abused in an institution, quite rightly, do not trust that institution. Why on earth should they? That their experience in that institution has been destructive for their lives. And yet, in many of the settings I've worked in, survivors have been willing to come in and try and play a part. And some of the most impressive colleagues I worked with, both in England and Wales and on the Pontifical Commission, were people who were survivors, not all of them publicly known as that. But that was why they'd started to get involved to try and change things. And unless we listen, and when I say listen, I mean really listen, not just, pretend to listen, but unless we listen to the experience, the church will never change. It will never improve.
Bill, when it comes to this behind closed doors and the abuse victims or survivors, would they know at least what happened to their case? Would they be informed about what has been going on?
Well, they should be. That should be the minimum requirement, that once a decision has been made, they should be the first that should be the first person that knows. And they should know the outcome, and they should also know the consequence for the person who abused them.
Mhm.
And I think that is often missing. I remember a colleague of mine on the Pontifical Commission, Mary Collins, and she was a very powerful member of the commission. And she said to me that for her, one of the key steps in her healing was when she went to court and she heard the priest who had abused her as a young teenager in hospital, when she heard him admit his guilt. And so she actually saw him physically and heard that admission and saw a court deal with him and give him a penalty, imprisonment.
So it's
And that was
accountability.
crucial. So knowing the outcome is absolutely vital.
I can
don't know
also
if
speak to that, Bill and Beate, insofar as I have my own experience with the A Path to Healing process and with NOPS, and I also know of the experience of many of our members. And indeed, Beate, at the end of the process, the competent church authority, whether it be a bishop in the case of abuse in a diocese or a congregational leader in the case of abuse in a religious order, does inform the victim, who they call as a complainant. The NOPS uses the word complainant. So the complainant is of course informed of the outcome. However, the reasons for the decision are not given. For example, we have a lot of, the majority of the people who reach out to SNAP have their complaints denied. So therefore, at the end of the process, they're informed from a letter, via a letter from the church authority, that their complaint has not been upheld on a balance of probabilities. So the language that is used, the pattern that is used from the church authority is simply that the church authority has heard from the Complaints Assessment Committee that has made the recommendation that on a balance of probabilities, the complaint should not be upheld. However, no information is given as to what was in the investigator's report. Several of our members have gone back to the investigator to find out what they did or what they didn't do regarding contacting people to create a single file, one report from one investigator to present to a committee that is unknown, as Bill said, that makes a recommendation to the church authority, that the church authority has always upheld that recommendation. But the recommendation is that on a balance of probabilities, your complaint cannot be proven, therefore it is denied, therefore there's no admission of wrongdoing, therefore there's certainly no healing, and that's a pattern across the board. So granted, of course, the survivor knows the decision, but the reasons for that decision are never provided. I have not seen any, even when it's been asked, when the complainant has gone back to the church authority to ask questions, the church authority therefore refers back to the committee that is secret, and NOPS intervenes at that point and says that that's private information that we can't divulge. A misnomer, as the evidence in the Royal Commission pointed out, to refer to the redress process of NOPS, which is technically called A Path to Healing. We believe that is a misnomer to call that A Path to Healing.
I think the question about accountability, that's something that is in any kind of abuse, not just church connected to the church. It's emotional, physical, and psychological abuse. It's always important that you can see that there's an accountability. That's more important than any money or anything else. Because in abuse, often the abuser uses language that makes the abused feel like they caused it. They are guilty for their own abuse. And if there's then no accountability, then the whole situation gets worse, because then the victim thinks again, oh, maybe I was not the victim. And I think that will prolong the path of healing, certainly.
This is happening right now in the Catholic Church, Beate, where victims are being told that the priest who the victim believes broke boundaries and abused, the church authority is simply saying that Father so-and-so was trying to provide pastoral care. but pastoral care should not extend to touching in inappropriate ways, and also, which is, of course, is grooming to make the person feel comfortable. And of course, I'm not talking about explicit assault, but simply in breaching professional standards by touching vulnerable people who come to the priest for counselling. But we have church leaders in New Zealand today in Catholic churches who are writing to victims as complainants and telling them that what they experienced is what they believe they experienced is not what they experienced. There's a word for that. It's called gaslighting, unfortunately, by which the victim therefore does begin to question herself, question her reality, to the point where, as you just said, it's commonly called victim blaming. But unfortunately now we have certain church leaders who are trying to discredit the testimony of survivors. And what's most upsetting right now is that this is happening immediately after the inquiry phase of the Royal Commission ended. That now we have church leaders in New Zealand who are accusing victims of being angry, vitriolic, for example. Therefore, rather than focusing on the priest, the accused, the complainant becomes a problem.
Chris, can you just tell a little bit about the working together with NOPS, because you are a part of a survivors network, and if NOPS is the Office for Professional Standards, in order to improve standards, you usually communicate and work together with those on the ground. I assume that there is some kind of cooperation between you and between SNAP and NOPS.
Well, there should be, of course, absolutely. And if all church leaders were to fulfill their professional standards, then they would be the first to want to get into a relationship with Survivors Network, but it's not happening at all. I just want to clarify that SNAP, of course, is independent. We don't have any affiliation with any organisation. We're an independent, non-partisan, non-faith-based, of course, survivor support network. However, again, our primary purpose is to support survivors. So we don't have any direct dealings with NOPS, what's on the level of a network. However, our members do. So again, I want to draw away from SNAP being an organisation or being an institution. We're not. We're survivors connected to each other, supporting one another. So therefore, what I find often is that a person will call the SNAP line or reach out to SNAP wanting to know how to file a complaint with the church, or wanting to know what the consequences could be of filing a complaint with the church, meaning NOPS. And therefore, we provide peer support to guide them through that process. Sometimes we've been asked if we could do it for them, which we have done. However, we strongly advocate supporting the survivor to do it themselves, not taking over the process, which is the wisdom of Judith Herman, who said any intervention that takes power away from the survivor, no matter how much is in their best interest, doesn't ultimately lead to the recovery of the survivor. But of course, many survivors out there, for the very reason that we call ourselves survivors, are not always in that position to be able to do that. Therefore, that's why we provide peer support. So indeed, we encourage, despite the experience, we do still encourage people to file their complaints with NOPS. But we do try to share with them what the average experience has been and the result has been, so to keep their expectations very, very low, sadly, when it comes to the facts on the ground regarding the consequences of going through that. It's quite traumatic. It is not what is promised. Again, the Path to Healing process promises very clearly accountability, openness, transparency, a compassionate response and a fair response. I'm sorry to say that in our empirical evidence, which means we can show you what the survivors have experienced, and this was all disclosed at the Royal Commission, that is not what's happening on the ground. So NOPS presents quite well with policy, but when it comes to practice, we try to hold NOPS to account. We also encourage our members and those who contact us, who reach out to NOPS, to include us in, to include this generic SNAP email into their correspondence as well. So NOPS knows we know, because that's what openness and transparency is about, and that's not what they do. NOPS is constantly trying to hide behind not sharing information, not disclosing information. And I'm not talking about privacy, personal data. I mean, that's private. As Bill said, we have strong privacy laws, and they can be good. However, when it comes to process, And when it comes to information regarding process, that should all be easily disclosed, but NOPS keeps that quite secretive too, unfortunately, in our experience.
Chris, you mentioned now a few times the New Zealand Royal Commission of Inquiry. Bill, it was in your time as head of NOPS that the New Zealand Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care and Faith-Based Institutions was established.
Yes.
When this was the case, what were your expectations? What were your hopes regarding this commission?
Well, when it was first announced, it was only going to look into state care. And I went to see a number of people to persuade them to extend it. I started off with it was going before a committee in Parliament, and one of the members of that committee was an Auckland Member of Parliament, Jacinda Ardern, and this was before she was leader of the Labour Party. And I went and had a long session with her explaining what I thought the benefits from the Australian experience and experience elsewhere was, and why it was very important to have faith-based institutions in the Royal Commission remit. And then when the civil servants were setting it up, again, I went to see them. This was while I was still at NOPS. And when I retired from NOPS, I did quite a few interviews with the press and with the radio about this, because I thought this was an ideal opportunity to really understand just the scale of the issue in New Zealand, because until then, people thought this was a small thing, a few people. Obviously, they would say, it's not like Ireland, it's not like America, it's not like Australia. The church never learns. They can't see that the experience of one country is most likely the experience here as well. And so at the very least, the Royal Commission uncovered to some extent the scale of the issue. And I think people were quite shocked by the numbers. And that's just the numbers of complaints that were known. The number that the church had logged as complaints over many years. And what we know, I started led an inquiry into abuse way back in the 1990s, which is why I was involved. What we all know, and particularly survivor groups know, is that the people who come forward and report the abuse are the minority of people who've been abused, not the majority. And so you look at horrific figures and you have to bear in mind that that's not the whole story. So I thought the Royal Commission would be good at getting at least that information out, and then really testing the organisations about their redress system. Because in my view, the church and the other churches in New Zealand do not have systems for redress that are fit for purpose, none of them. And I don't think the churches should be allowed to continue running it. I think it should be taken out of the churches and done independently, because I don't think you'll ever, I don't know whether this is too harsh on some people, but I don't think you'll ever get a good, accountable, transparent system within the Catholic Church or within other churches who are equally restrictive about how they work with survivors. If you think of the power imbalance in churches, most churches that the Commission looked at, that the Royal Australian Commission looked at, common features: leadership by men only, tremendous power vested in them, not just because of their position, but also because of the link to God. And that's an aspect of faith-based abuse that doesn't occur elsewhere. It occurs in many faiths, but where the person who's abusing is somebody who is claiming to be acting for God. A priest, how often in theology in the Catholic Church refers to a priest as alter Christus, and the power that gives. So faith abuse by clergy and these is tremendously powerful and damaging. It brings a whole other aspect to it. And I just don't think, from what I've seen in the church here, in the other churches that came to the commission, I don't think they're up to the task.
Do you think that the New Zealand, that the inquiry system through the state has worked somehow?
I was disappointed, to be honest, by the Royal Commission in many ways. I thought they could have looked in more depth at the current practice of the church. And instead of, they looked at one area of horrendous abuse, which was a place in Christchurch for very vulnerable, but from some years ago, run by the St. John of God. But I think if they'd looked in detail at a diocese, for example, and its current practice, there were statements made at that Royal Commission certainly by very recently retired bishop, that were, should have been absolutely pursued. And that would have been a much better example of looking in detail at how an organisation works.
I note that Bishop also made the statement that the structure and the culture that caused the abuse or allowed the abuse to happen failed us and needs to change. And you're quite right, Bill. There have been no changes. Despite saying the right thing on record at the Royal Commission, the church itself has not made the required changes to prevent the abuse from happening again. I just want to add that, remember from my own experience, because I went to all boys schools in the Catholic Church, both at the primary, intermediate and secondary levels. I'm speaking about an all boys experience. The schools that I went to, and a lot of the abuse in the Catholic Church took place in Catholic schools across New Zealand. Those schools were, since 1975, integrated with the state. So that's why I thought, when the Royal Commission was founded, that it would be unfair if the abuse that I suffered and many of my classmates suffered at a Catholic school wasn't also taken into account. Because again, the direct responsibility, of course, is the care of the Catholic Church. However, because of the Integration Act, the overall responsibility is also the state. Therefore, the separation of church and state that the Royal Commission originally claimed and that we still have today, it really doesn't exist. And I think we have moved well beyond the so-called Enlightenment of the European history that had the church and the state together. So we've separated them, but I think we now need to reassess the merits of having a separate church and state when it comes to issues like this. There needs to be some kind of subordination, I would claim, of church agencies to a greater, to another organization, an independent organization. I know there are problems with the state too, but there are major problems with church agencies that they're not accountable, they're not responsible to anyone but themselves.
I'd like to ask Bill, when I talk to some Catholics, I often hear the comment that they feel embarrassed. And what you said is quite shocking when you have a huge number, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, possibly. But many people are embarrassed that so much of the historic abuse has been uncovered in Catholic institutions and settings. How do you think innocent clergy, religious, lay people who've lived their lives in integrity, how could they be best protected against the general smearing and blaming of the whole church?
Well, in some ways, the answer is they can't be, because the church, it is the church that's responsible for what's happened. And if we're all members of the church, we all have some responsibility for how the church operates. Now, the sort of change you'd want to see is in the Catholic Church, for example, there is no real accountability. To whom is a bishop accountable? Who can call them to account? The parish priest. Very little accountability. Certainly compared with if you were working in another profession, you'd have much more structured accountability. You'd have means of looking at behaviours, whether it was appropriate. There's very little in the Catholic Church. And I think the church has been hammered hard, but it has, as Hans Zollner said, it has earned that by its own actions, because we've, as a church, we've just not lived up to our mission. And so we've not lived up to the gospel in the way we've looked after children. It's very hard when Christopher's the same. He knows lots, he knows from his own experience, he knows from the survivors he supports. I've worked with survivors for, I don't know how many years, many, many years. And indeed, we, when we were in England, we fostered children for many years who were children that were removed from the families in emergency situations, who were often abused. So we had people living with us, sharing our lives. It's the most profound impact it has on anybody. And I just don't think the church has listened. I don't think the leadership has listened. And I think we're still letting down. And I think people want to pretend that it was all in the past. They want to pretend that we've got the Royal Commission now, we've done and dusted it, we can all go back to normal. No, we can't. People haven't changed, the church hasn't changed. Abuse won't just suddenly stop because there's been a Royal Commission. It is a reality of life, sadly.
Chris, with these words that Bill has just said, what is the connection between the survivors that you know and from SNAP? What is their relationship to the church? Have they all drifted away because they feel forgotten, or are there some who say we want to rebuild a new church that is stronger when it comes to abuse, so that it's not going to happen anymore? What is your experience?
Well, first of all, let's remember that every single person who was abused in the Catholic Church was abused because they were a member of the Catholic Church or connected to the Catholic Church on some level, right? So we are talking about people who were already in the Catholic Church. Therefore, everyone in the Catholic Church is vulnerable today because of the systems and the culture of the Catholic Church, including the clergy themselves. They're vulnerable themselves. So, of course, the people create the systems and the culture, but the culture and the systems produce the people who are within it. So to answer your question, in general, from my experience and also my research, there are three kinds of people or three kinds of relationships that survivors have with the church. The majority, from the research and from experience, the majority of those abused in the church just leave. The majority just leave. And that's the way they deal with it. No one, in my view, has any right to ever question how a victim of abuse responds to that abuse. There's no wrong response. But from what I know, and the research speaks to this, most people who are abused leave. Most people who were abused, remain silent. Now, this is key to understand. So the majority leave. Those who were abused, we're talking about just the abused in the Catholic Church. The majority leave. Those who remain, The majority of those who remain silent. Therefore, those who speak out, who remain connected, are a minority. And they unfortunately are part of that group that, to use the language of the to ascribe to them the church, which I'm very slow to use the language of referring to the church, because I am a member of the church who also remains connected and speaks out. Therefore, I think that the work that those people who remain connected and speak out are doing is admirable, and they are a minority. Therefore, I certainly understand the usage of the term, and I entirely agree with Bill when we refer to the Catholic Church. However, I do prefer to use the word church leaders, the church hierarchy, church officials, when it comes to those being responsible, because if there were a shift in the voice, as Francis has just asked, just this very month, Pope Francis, in a beautiful address that was given to the safeguarding officers of Italy, where he said, the work of safeguarding is not the work of safeguarding officers only. It's the work of everyone in the Catholic Church. So even though we have safeguarding officers, everyone who is a member of the Catholic Church is bound by their very Christian mandate to safeguard. Therefore, we can't just relegate to a group of people who have been handpicked by church leaders to do safeguarding, which we know is not taking place today. It is not taking place in New Zealand. There is no safeguarding in New Zealand today when it comes to actually enforcing safeguarding standards. We can come back to that, but we know what the standards are. But I've reached out to church leaders in New Zealand, asking them, have they implemented their safeguarding standards in this particular case, in that particular case, where we have priests in ministry today who have been very credibly accused and they have not been stood down. And how have the church leaders responded? They've shut us down. They've shut down those questions. I'm talking about the highest level of the Catholic Church in New Zealand. So therefore, I'm talking about church leadership. I'm not talking about Catholic Church. Really quickly, Beata, just to answer your question, I do believe there is a simple way of not smearing everyone in the Catholic Church because of the abuse. And this takes a courageous act of church leaders to name the accused. All they need to do is name the accused. That means all the other priests who have not been accused are not smeared. I'm not saying that they're not accusers either, because we don't know that. According to the metadata, there are a lot of people out there who have simply not been accused, who are probably abusers themselves, because we know that because of the statistics. For example, one of my complaints is against a priest in the Diocese of Palmerston North, and apparently I'm the only one who's complained about him. But according to the statistics, that doesn't mean that he hasn't abused other people as well. Because if we take Hawke's Bay as an example, from the research I have done, 1 in 12 have reported. 1 in 12 victims have reported. So I know who the victims are, because I have the privileged information. And of that group of 12, 1 has reported. And they're all victims. So therefore, that's what we know. Therefore, if you multiply that by the metadata of those who are abused also that we don't know about, between 6 to 12 times the 12 are the victims, and 1 has reported. So you do the math, that's exponential. However, my point is that the accused are innocent until proven guilty. But if we simply told the New Zealand public, which I hope we will get to that point, that these priests, these religious leaders have been accused, that means that Father X and Father Y have not been accused, therefore they're not smeared too. And that means the entire clergy are not smeared by simply naming the accused. I don't know whether we can actually get to that transparency and that openness, because of course the accused don't want to be named. Therefore, my point is the church leaders are doing a massive disservice to their own clergy by not allowing those who have been accused to be named.
Chris, thank you very much. I do have to say we have to come to the end of the interview, but thank you so much. And I think that we have to work on making the church a safer place, and that starts with us ourselves. And it starts with watching what's happening and being alert. And as Bill said, truly listen. And thank you very much for your volunteer work on the Survivors Network, Aotearoa. And thank you, Bill, for your work and for your dedication. You certainly have made a change, and especially when it comes to the faith-based Royal Commission. So thank you both for your contributions.
Thank you very much, Beate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Beate.
Thank
It's
you.
good to see you.